Kyiv, early morning, February 25, 2022, beneath a Soviet-era government building. In a dim underground bunker, Volodymyr Zelensky sits upright. He's wearing an olive-green t-shirt, eyes fixed on the camera. A harsh yellow light washes over his sleepless face, tired, but burning with resolve. Outside, sirens, explosions, and the cries of a city under attack. Just hours earlier, the United States offered to evacuate him. He refused, and delivered the line that would define him. "I need ammunition, not a ride." That image, a comedian turned president refusing to flee, spread across the world like wildfire. In a moment, Zelensky became more than a leader. He became a symbol of courage, of resistance, of dignity in the face of violence. But was this truly a heroic moment? Or was it a tragic one, where an entire nation had to place its fate in the survival instincts of a man best known for stand-up comedy? Blank. There are two ways to understand the war in Ukraine. The first is told by journalist Simon Shuster in The Showman. In his view, Zelensky embodies a new Ukraine, young, defiant, and willing to say no to both Moscow and the West. This resistance is fought not just with weapons, but with language, imagery, and inspiration. The second is colder and more uncomfortable. Historian Jonathan Haslam, in Hubris, argues this war didn't start in 2022. It is the consequence of 3 decades of strategic arrogance, Russia refusing to accept defeat, and the West believing freedom could be imposed through NATO expansion. In this version, Zelensky is not the architect, he's a piece on the board. A pawn forced to become a king because there was no one else left to play. So to truly understand Zelensky, we have to look deeper, beyond the viral speeches and dramatic footage. Back to his origins, to his youth in post-Soviet Ukraine, and to the illusions the West clung to about a post-Cold War Russia. Before he was president, Zelensky was one of Eastern Europe's most famous comedians. Born in 1978 to a Jewish family in the industrial city of Kryvyi Rih. He grew up far from politics or privilege. His father was a professor. His mother, an engineer. No political connections. No elite backing. Zelensky trained as a lawyer, but never practiced. Instead, he created a comedy troupe called Kvartal 95, known for satirical sketches, sharp takes on corruption, and giving audiences a break from the grim reality of post-Soviet life. In 2015, he starred in a TV series called Servant of the People, playing a history teacher who unexpectedly becomes president. The show became so popular that 3 years later, he made the script real. No party machine, no political experience, no detailed platform, just one thing, a public craving for someone, anyone, outside the rotten political class. And he won. Zelensky entered politics with the hope that he could negotiate peace with Putin, that if Ukraine offered sincerity, Russia would show restraint. He didn't believe war was inevitable. He believed dialogue could defeat imperialism. He was wrong. Putin didn't want dialogue, he wanted control. Even before the war, Zelensky faced serious setbacks, stalled reforms, scandals involving close allies, and growing mistrust between him and Ukraine's oligarchs. To many Western diplomats at the time, he was a media president, great at optics, weak on substance. And yet, when the moment of crisis arrived, that media instinct became a weapon. Zelensky didn't flee, he appeared exactly where he needed to be, when he needed to be, with short, powerful messages that moved millions. He knew how to look into the camera as if he was speaking directly to each citizen. He knew how to be brief when sound bites mattered, and how to be emotional when the world needed empathy. This wasn't performance in the shallow sense. It was professional instinct, sharpened over decades. And in an era where images move faster than missiles, whoever controls the narrative controls the will to resist. Shuster calls it image-based politics. In that moment, as missiles fell and cities burned, Zelensky turned war into a story. One where he was the narrator, and the whole world was the audience. But here's the question, can the narrator control how the story ends? Or is he simply recounting a tragedy that was written long ago? For millions watching, the war began on February 24, 2022, when Russian tanks crossed the border and missiles rained down on Kyiv. But history rarely begins when we start paying attention. If you ask Professor Jonathan Haslam, one of the most seasoned experts on Russian foreign policy, he'd tell you, This war didn't begin in 2022. It began the moment the Soviet Union collapsed. In 1991, the USSR disintegrated. A communist empire vanished almost overnight. But instead of being buried by history, that empire left behind a dangerous vacuum, one no one dared to fill. And few truly understood. The West, the United States and Europe, believed they had won. Democracy, free markets, and freedom of the press would spread across Eastern Europe. And NATO, originally formed to counter the Soviets, would expand eastward. Step by step, they assumed Russia would accept it, or at least stay quiet. But Russia never forgot. The Russia of the 1990s was a humiliated country, broken, and patronized by the West like a schoolchild. The ruble collapsed, daily life disintegrated, and most of all, national pride was shattered. Out of this chaos, an old elite began to rise again. They no longer believed in the Western model. What they wanted was to restore what they called Great Russia, not just economically, but by reasserting control over their lost sphere of influence. To them, Ukraine was never truly independent. It was a wayward province, one that needed to be pulled back into place. But the West didn't see it coming. From 1999 to 2004, NATO welcomed three major waves of expansion: Poland, Hungary, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Romania, Bulgaria, all joined the alliance. Putin, who rose to power in 2000, saw this as a betrayal. In speech after speech, he called NATO expansion an existential threat. And while he maintained ties with the West for over a decade, in his mind, the counteroffensive was already being planned. Ukraine became a psychological battleground. After the Maidan Revolution in 2014, when Ukrainians ousted pro-Russian President Yanukovych and turned decisively toward Europe, Putin struck back by seizing Crimea. It wasn't just a military move, it was a warning: don't come any closer. From 2014 to 2022, a slow, grinding war unfolded in eastern Ukraine, the Donbas. Nearly 14,000 people died. But the world moved on. Ukraine was left to fight alone. During this time, both the EU and the US hesitated. They wanted to help Ukraine, but feared provoking Russia. The result: half measures, vague security pledges, and, most damaging of all, strategic ambiguity. Ukraine was allowed to drift toward NATO, but without any clear protection if war broke out. That ambiguity, according to Haslam, was the trap. Putin understood that the West wouldn't die for Ukraine. Meanwhile, Ukraine believed it had the West behind it. And so both sides played a dangerous game of escalation, until, inevitably, someone pulled the trigger. That day was February 24, 2022. So what role did Zelensky play in this setup? Haslam's view: he wasn't the cause, just the inheritor of an impossible map. A political outsider thrown into the center of a conflict that had been programmed decades earlier. And no matter how brave or skilled he might be, Ukraine's strategic foundation remained fragile, wedged between two powers, one untrustworthy, the other unwilling to bend. When Russian missiles began to strike Kyiv, many expected Zelensky to run. The US and UK both anticipated he would flee to Poland, form a government in exile, and preserve some semblance of legal continuity. But he didn't run. Just hours into the invasion, Zelensky recorded a selfie-style video from the heart of Kyiv, holding a mic in one hand, standing with his top officials. He looked into the lens and said, "I'm here, we're all here, our soldiers are here, our government is here, the people, we're all here." A few short sentences, no dramatic speech, no broadcast studio, but the media impact, explosive. That clip shattered Russia's entire narrative. In an instant, the man dismissed as a comedian with no strategy became the center of the world's attention. But inside the bunker, things weren't nearly so clear-cut. According to Shuster's reporting in The Showman, Ukraine's leadership was in total disarray during those first hours. Some generals had gone dark. Certain cabinet members panicked and pushed to flee. Key politicians left Kyiv altogether. Some flew to Poland. Others simply disappeared. Even Zelensky's wife and children were urgently evacuated to a secret location. But Zelensky stayed, not because he had a clear military plan, but because he knew, if he left, everything else would collapse. This wasn't military strategy. This was symbolic politics. In moments of crisis, people don't look for generals, they look for belief. And Zelensky, with his instinct for the stage, filled that void with presence. language, and imagery. He appeared constantly on social media, gave press briefings, took interviews with US, French, German, and Japanese television. In those first few days, he barely slept 2 hours a night. Yet he always showed up, delivering short, powerful lines that struck the perfect balance between intimacy and resolve. His performance wasn't fake, it was his craft. And in a war where information spreads faster than artillery, the one who controls the image controls the narrative. But cracks began to show. Some advisors worried Zelensky was becoming addicted to his own image, more focused on sustaining a global symbol than listening to battlefield truths. At times, his optimism made commanders hesitate to report bad news. In some cases, he rejected tactical retreats, fearing they'd look weak on camera. One close aide reportedly said, "He's no longer the president of Ukraine. He's the image of Ukraine." The Russians expected Kyiv to fall in 3 days. But after 3 weeks, it still stood. Ukraine's army, under-equipped, underfunded, underestimated, had not only held the line but pushed back critical Russian offensives. That surprising resilience came from many sources: fierce morale, Western intelligence, and a string of Russian strategic blunders. But one thing held the entire structure together: the continued presence and visibility of the president. Zelensky isn't a general, he's not a military expert, but he understood his role: to give the country a face, a voice, a psychological anchor amid chaos. Day after day, he spoke before parliaments across the world: the US Congress, the UK Parliament, the EU, the Bundestag, Japan's Diet. With each speech, he tailored the message to the audience. To the US, he invoked Pearl Harbor and 9/11. To the British, he echoed Churchill: "We will fight in the forests, on the shores, we will not surrender." To the Germans, he called on them to tear down a new wall between freedom and tyranny, invoking the Berlin Wall itself. He didn't write every speech, but he owned every delivery. His tone, his silences, even his eye contact, all calibrated to touch each audience's core. From a performer, he had become the director of a global emotional campaign, not through treaties, but through feeling, and it worked. No modern leader had ever received such resounding applause from so many parliaments. No country had ever secured such massive aid in so little time. But every success has a price. When an image becomes too powerful, it can start to obscure reality. Zelensky began struggling with internal governance. Some military officials urged him to focus on logistics and long-term planning instead of media outreach. At one point, the defense minister warned of severe ammunition shortages, only to be ignored, because the message clashed with the victory optimism being projected to the world. Tensions grew between Zelensky and his top general, Volodymyr Zelensky, dubbed the Second Zelensky by some. Despite his popularity among troops and civilians, Zelensky was dismissed in early 2024. As Shuster put it, Zelensky seemed to believe only one story should be told, and he was the only one allowed to tell it. Meanwhile, pressure from Western allies intensified. The US demanded anti-corruption reforms. The EU pushed for transparency in aid distribution. Through it all, Zelensky had to keep wearing the armor of the tireless hero, even as months without sleep began to wear him down. And the most dangerous part: whenever that heroic image began to fade, so did international trust. This is the paradox of wartime power. If you seem weak, no one helps you, but if you seem too strong, people start to wonder what you're hiding. Zelensky knows this. That's why he still shows up every day, still wears the military green, still delivers speeches, not because he loves the spotlight, but because he knows, in a war that no one can win overnight, image is the only thing that can outlast reality. The problem is this: inspiration can build belief, but victory requires a plan. And as the war enters its 3rd year, you have to ask, is image alone enough to hold together a country running out of breath? For more than 2 years, Ukraine's defiant, unified, and courageous image has persisted on the world stage. But inside the country, the foundations are eroding. Hundreds of thousands have gone to the front lines. Millions have left the country. The economy is in fiscal crisis. Missile strikes have repeatedly threatened the power grid every winter. Ukrainians still fight, but they no longer cheer every presidential speech. The fear that once electrified the nation has given way to exhaustion. The summer counteroffensive of 2023, once billed as a potential game-changer, failed to break through Russia's entrenched southern lines. Russia didn't gain much ground, But they held firm, bleeding Ukraine through a strategy of attrition and entrenchment. Western headlines began to shift, from praise to doubt. They started asking uncomfortable questions. Has Zelensky misread the situation? Is he clinging to an unrealistic dream of total victory? Should Ukraine have entered negotiations sooner, before the losses became irreparable? Inside Ukraine, fractures began to show. Political opposition groups, once silent in wartime unity, re-emerged to criticize the government over mishandled aid, stalled judicial reforms, and especially the dismissal of popular military leaders. The anti-corruption agenda that helped Zelensky win office began to stall. Some ministers were investigated, but public trust faded. People began asking, were these purges really about transparency? Or just about consolidating power? And then there was the quiet truth few dared say aloud. Zelensky had grown too big to challenge. He was no longer just a leader. He was the face of resistance. The face of foreign aid. To criticize him was to risk weakening the nation itself. Shuster, in The Showman, calls this the trap of symbolism when a leader becomes captive to the legend they helped create. Meanwhile, support from Western allies was no longer a given. Across Europe, populist elections and rising anti-immigration sentiment forced governments to prioritize domestic politics over global strategy. Ukraine understood, time was no longer on its side. Zelensky understood this too, and his rhetoric began to shift. From, "we will win," to, "we need more time." From, "Russia has no chance," to, "we will never surrender. No matter what." From talk of bold counterattacks to a more sober focus, defending what had already been reclaimed. And in this moment, the question of the post-war future became impossible to avoid. If Ukraine remains independent but gives up territory, is that victory or defeat? If the war ends but the society is broken and the economy collapses, can symbolic triumph rebuild a nation? And ultimately, when Zelensky inevitably steps down, who could replace a figure so tightly bound to the very identity of wartime Ukraine? Because war, in the end, is never just between two states. It is a test of a society, a young democracy, and a generation of leaders who have never truly lived in peace. And now, both Ukraine and Zelensky are entering the hardest phase of all, to survive the war, and to survive what comes after. On June 25, 2025, President Zelensky appeared in Strasbourg, France, wearing a dark suit. He signed the founding document for a special tribunal to prosecute Russia's crime of aggression, a symbolic gesture. Yes, but also a precise political counterstrike. This was not the International Criminal Court, which had already issued an arrest warrant for Putin. This was a new court, designed to focus solely on the core crime, the illegal invasion that made every other war crime possible. Zelensky's message was sharp and direct. We must prove that aggression will be punished. All of Europe must act together. That same day, at the NATO summit in The Hague, Zelensky stepped into a very different room, one where he met with US President Donald Trump for a 50-minute private conversation. It was, by many accounts, a strange exchange. Trump said he wanted to end the war and would call Putin directly. Zelensky replied, "Putin will not win." They discussed Patriot systems, drones, various forms of aid, but no concrete commitments emerged. Zelensky was still in the fight, but no longer in command of the table. The power centers were shifting. Ukraine was no longer the focus of NATO's agenda. This year's final communiqué mentioned Ukraine only twice, down from 59 times in the 2024 Washington summit. On the battlefield, Ukraine did land a major strategic blow, halting Russia's summer offensive in Sumy. Over 50,000 Russian troops were pinned down, unable to redeploy to other fronts. General Shuster declared, "The enemy's summer offensive is collapsing." Zelensky quickly capitalized on the momentum, framing the victory as proof that Ukraine could still strike back, not just defend. But just 2 days earlier, Russia had launched missiles into the city of Dnipro, killing 22 civilians, wounding more than 300, and destroying schools, hospitals, a train station, even a theater. When a nation signs a legal treaty in Strasbourg and buries its civilians in Dnipro on the same day, you begin to realize, this is no longer just a war, it's prolonged endurance beyond logic. Zelensky still fights for the narrative, still projects the image of a leader who won't back down. But beneath the surface, the harder truths are mounting. The West is fractured. Russia still has resources and new allies, from North Korea to Iran. And the Ukrainian people, after more than 850 days of war, are starting to ask, when will this end? In this moment, Zelensky returned to the one tool that never failed him: storytelling. The special tribunal, the NATO summit, the battlefield win in Sumy, the drone strike on Taganrog, all of it was woven together in a tightly edited 3-minute evening broadcast that Zelensky narrated himself on June 25. In it, he said, "Ukraine has never stopped fighting, and the world must never forget why this war began." A familiar line, a familiar face, but beneath that, a question no one dares ask aloud: is the storyteller still in control of the story? Or has the story begun to control him? There is a paradox unfolding. Zelensky is still the face of Ukraine, but no longer the one steering everything around him. He can control the lighting of the camera, but not the timing of Western arms shipments. He can inspire the European Parliament, but not stop a missile from destroying a train station in Dnipro. He can sign a special tribunal, but cannot guarantee the accused will ever stand trial. How much of the story we believe is true, and how much is what we want to believe, just to keep going? Zelensky was the right leader at a time when no one else dared step forward. But now, he has become a symbol too large to replace, and if replaced, the entire system might tremble. He's no longer just a man, he's a story. And that is both magnificent and dangerous. If one day this war ends, if Putin falls, if Ukraine is rebuilt, how will history remember Zelensky? As the Churchill of Eastern Europe? Or as the greatest storyteller of an age that was too afraid to face the truth? The answer won't come from any book. It will come from the people of Ukraine, those who lived, who lost, and who endured, with or without a camera watching. And perhaps Zelensky already knows this. He cannot command history, but he can do the one thing he has always done better than anyone else: tell it, in a way the world cannot ignore.